The sun burned low over the dry hills of Redstone Valley, turning the sky to copper and blood. Jack Rowen, a rugged rancher with hands rough as the land itself, rode slowly into town, his horse limping from exhaustion. The dust clung to his shirt, the scent of sweat and gunpowder heavy on him. He had spent the last 2 days tracking down bandits who had taken a young woman from the Miller farm. He found her terrified but alive and brought her back under the dying light. But instead of gratitude, Redstone gave him mockery. They said he staged the whole thing, that he did it for attention. The town judge, a proud man with clean boots and a dirty soul, called him reckless. The saloon keeper laughed in his face. Even the woman he'd saved could barely speak from shock, and silence was taken as guilt. Jack stood there, staring at the faces that turned away. He'd risked his life to save someone's daughter, and all he got was shame and whispers. That night, he sat outside the stables, sharpening his old knife under the moonlight. The sound of steel on stone was the only comfort he had left. He thought about leaving the valley for good, about letting these people fend for themselves. But the image of the girl's frightened eyes kept returning. He hadn't saved her for praise. He'd done it because it was right. Still, the sting of humiliation ran deep. In the morning, when he walked through town, men spat near his boots. Women pulled their children close. The preacher shook his head like Jack was a sinner beyond redemption. Only old Ben, the blacksmith, gave him a nod of respect. "Don't let them break you, son," Ben muttered. "This town's memory is short, but truth rides longer than lies." Jack said nothing. He just adjusted his hat, mounted his horse, and began to ride out toward the open road. The town faded behind him, small and cruel in the morning sun. He didn't know that by sundown, Redstone's streets would echo with the sound of hooves 100 riders, strong coming not for vengeance, but for him. Because word travels faster than dust, and beyond the hills, men in armor knights, sworn to justice and honor had heard the tale of a rancher who saved a woman and was shamed for it. They were coming, not to fight, but to salute the man who stood alone when everyone else turned away. Jack's story wasn't over. It was just beginning. The morning stretched wide and empty as Jack rode beyond the valley. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and dust. Ahead lay endless road and silence. His hat cast a long shadow over eyes that had seen too much disappointment and not enough grace. Every hoofbeat seemed to hammer a question into the ground. Was it worth it? He had faced down men with guns and no mercy. Yet the sharpest wound had come from the words of his own people. It wasn't the bandits who had broken his spirit. It was the ones he'd fought to protect. He reached a ridge overlooking the open plains. Below, the land rolled like an ocean of gold. He paused there, letting his horse drink from a shallow stream. For a long moment, he just watched the water ripple, feeling something heavy in his chest begin to lift. "I did what was right," he muttered under his breath. "They can't take that from me." Suddenly, in the distance, the faint sound of thunder echoed not from the sky, but the earth, hooves, many of them. Jack turned, hand instinctively on his revolver. Over the rise came a glint of sunlight flashing off steel. A line of riders emerged, one after another, until the horizon shimmered with movement. At first, he thought it was the sheriff's men coming to arrest him again. But as they drew closer, he saw the banners blue and silver, marked with the sigil of the Order of the Plains, a legendary brotherhood of knights who protected settlers and travelers across the frontier. They were men of honor, half myth, half memory. And now, 100 of them rode straight toward him. Jack dismounted, standing tall despite his confusion, halted before him. He removed his helmet, revealing a face carved by sun and time. "You are Jack Rowen?" Jack nodded slowly. The knight smiled faintly. "Then today, sir, you ride with us." Jack frowned. "Ride with you? Why?" "Because word travels faster than lies," the knight replied. "We heard of your courage, how you stood alone when honor demanded it. The town may have turned its back, but men like us, men who still believe in what's right, do not forget." Behind him, the 100 knights raised their swords high, sunlight flashing off the steel. The air trembled with the power of their salute. For the first time in many years, the leader extended a hand. "Come, rancher. Today, you are one of us." Jack looked toward the horizon. then back at the line of men who believed in him without ever meeting him. Slowly, he took the knight's hand and mounted his horse beside them. The sound of 100 hooves rolled across the plains like thunder announcing a storm. The world would remember the name Jack Rowen not for shame, but for the day when one man's honor called 100 knights to rise. The next morning broke over Redstone with a silence too heavy for comfort. The townsfolk went about their chores, pretending not to remember the man they'd driven away. The saloon's doors swung lazily. The preacher prepared his sermon, but somewhere beyond the hills, the wind carried a low, distant rumble. Not thunder, something else. Old Ben, the blacksmith, was the first to hear it. He straightened, hammer frozen mid-swing. "That ain't no storm," he muttered. "That's hooves." By noon, the sound had grown a deep, rolling thunder that made windows rattle and horses rear. People poured into the streets, shading their eyes. A cloud of dust was rising from the ridge, growing larger every heartbeat. And then, like a vision from a dream, they appeared. 100 riders in silver and blue, their banners snapping in the wind, sunlight flashing off their armor. The crowd fell silent. Men who had spat at his boots the day before now stood frozen in awe. The preacher's hand trembled. The judge's cup slipped from his fingers and shattered on the ground. Jack's horse came to a stop in the middle of the street. His face was calm, shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. He didn't look angry, only certain. The leader of the knights raised his hand, and the line of riders halted in perfect unison, the sound echoing like the ending of a song. The judge stepped forward, his voice thin. "What is the meaning of this?" The knight dismounted, boots striking the dust. "The meaning," he said, "is honor. This man stood for what was right when none of you would. You mocked him for his courage. We ride today to remind you what respect looks like." The townspeople bowed their heads, shame heavy as the sun overhead. The woman Jack had saved, now stronger, her eyes clear, stepped from the crowd. "You believed lies," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "He risked everything for me, and you called him a fool." Jack turned his gaze toward her. "You owe me nothing," he said softly. "Just live true. That's enough." Then he faced the town. "I didn't come for revenge," he said. "I came to show you that doing right doesn't need applause, but sometimes it needs to be remembered." The knights raised their swords in salute. The sunlight flared, blinding and pure. It wasn't just a show of power, it was a declaration. That day, Redstone learned that honor rides on the quiet shoulders of men like Jack Rowen, men who do what's right when the world turns away. As he rode out again, the wind carried a sound that would stay in Redstone's heart forever. The echo of hooves and the applause of 100 knights saluting one man's truth. When the riders left Redstone, the dust they raised hung in the air like a storm that refused to settle. The town stood silent, every heart heavy with the weight of shame. For years they had spoken of justice, of faith, of decency, but when the time came to prove it, they had turned their backs on the only man who truly lived by those words. Jack Rowen didn't look back. The 100 knights rode beside him, their armor gleaming under the noon sun. But his thoughts were far away, back with the people he'd once called his own. He didn't hate them. He pitied them. The world had become small in their hearts, and they had forgotten what courage looked like until it stood before them with dust on its boots. A few miles out, the riders halted near the river bend. The leader dismounted, stepping close to Jack. "You could ride with us, Rowen," he said. "Men like you belong where honor is still worth something." Jack smiled faintly. "Honor doesn't belong to orders or banners, sir." The knight studied him, then nodded with quiet respect. "Then ride your own road, rancher. The world needs men like you, free and fearless." Jack tipped his hat and turned his horse toward the distant hills. As he rode away, the knights raised their swords once more, a final salute to the man who had reminded them all what truth looked like. Back in Redstone, the days passed slower. The townsfolk rebuilt their fences, repaired their roofs, but something in them had changed. The preacher rewrote his Sunday sermon, this time speaking not of sin, but of courage. Judge Colton resigned within the week, and the Miller family, the ones who had lost their daughter and nearly lost their faith, hung a wooden sign at the town gate. It read, "Honor rides with the brave." Old Ben, the blacksmith, kept a single horseshoe from Jack's horse above his forge. When travelers came through and asked about the rancher who rode with knights, he'd smile and say, "Jack Rowen? He ain't no myth. He's just a man who did what was right when it mattered." Years later, songs were written about that day, the day one rancher's humility brought 100 knights to their knees. And somewhere beyond the horizon, in the vast silence of the plains, Jack still rode, carrying nothing but his name and his truth, because legends aren't born from fame or fortune. They're forged in dust, in pain, and in the quiet courage of those who keep riding long after the world turns its back.